Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Guys, I'm back again. This time, I better do this now or I'm never going to get to it. Part 4, the final chapter, Terry Riley. I got a half a dozen CDs, and I'm just hoping I can keep this under 17 hours. Where do I start? I made a lot of mental notes, and I know what's going to happen is I'm going to remember half of them, and as soon as I'm done recording the video, I'm going to remember the other half. But I'm only giving this one shot because I don't know how worth it is it to anyone to go into such detail. For the most part, you know, I was initially attempting to do these in some kind of logical order, you know, with mostly Terry Riley performance albums in one section, and maybe collaborations in another section, and was only partially successful at that. But today, I've got a couple. I've got mostly Terry Riley works of more recent vintage. I think everything here, the oldest goes back to 1988, recorded in 88, released in 89. So it's more of the current stuff. We're not going back to the 60s or 70s, and just barely skirting into the 80s. So the first couple things I'm going to show are kind of like conceptual works that Terry does play in collaboration with other musicians or contributors. Well, let me start. The first thing, anyway, is of more recent vintage of Terry, and actually, it's not the one I have playing because I've already screwed up the order. So let me go to the one I'm going to show now. To what extent you can hear the music, because it's very difficult for me to work out the audio level. I will once again be attempting to play the albums that I'm speaking about, so the music in the background, to whatever extent you can hear it, is from the albums I'm talking about. The only catch is I'm a little concerned with the copyright thing, because I know with the other Terry Riley videos I did get copyright warnings. And the bad thing, of course, is that you know, if they decide to, they could mute the audio for specific sections, so you'll see me mouthing the words, but you won't hear anything. I hope that won't be the case. I know I'm going to get a copyright notice anyway. So this first thing is an unusual, kind of like a concept album that Terry Riley did. What year is it? I want to say it's the late 90s. I'm looking it up here, but I've got a long list of his albums, and it's not coming up. Anyway, I'm gonna say it's 2004, I think. Maybe that's why I'm not seeing it, because the list only goes up to 2002. Yeah, I think yes. 2002, an album called Atlantis Nath, N-A-T-H. Kind of a concept album. Part of it's based on his Indian music teacher that he learned traditional Indian voice from. I think maybe tabla as well. And long been his kind of mentor, I guess you could call him. So it's a nice, interesting digipack some very nice artwork on it. Like I said, it's called Atlantis Nath. Terry is the main performer on this. There's other performers as well. Very nice digipack from about 2002. Folds out several times. I mean, this would have been a hell of an LP in terms of art. There's the CD in there. Terry's doing voice on here. He's doing piano. I guess synthesizer. They credit it as being MIDI. So, I guess it's got to be synthesizer or a MIDI piano. But it's a little strange that they don't specify what the MIDI instruments are. He's got collaborators, a guy, Luke Martinez, which is a little bit odd because Luke Martinez actually contributes a couple pieces that weren't written by Terry. A couple small, short pieces, like a minute, 3 minutes long. And they're almost... when I heard them, I knew they weren't Terry Riley because they're less music and they're more environmental sound kind of things, where like he may have taken recordings from sounds outside and processed them. So, it doesn't sound like an instrument being played so much. And when I heard it, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound like something Terry Riley would do. So I don't really know. According to Terry Riley's, somewhere I read, I guess he thought that it helped convey, I guess, the concept of the album. Not that you really even need to know it. The print is so small inside of here that I haven't even bothered to read it. That it's so impossibly small. You have to get a magnifying glass to read it. But there's a guy that does some spoken text on here. Like I said, the couple pieces inserted by Luke Martinez that are between the Terry Riley pieces, the album could have done without. They're interesting little sound effect tone poem things. I don't really know how you describe it. It's an interesting album. It's definitely one that I'm not sorry I picked up. In the Terry Riley world, like I said, there's things which are difficult, and there's things that I, are kind of hesitant to recommend, except for somebody who's already a hardcore Terry Riley fan. This still would not be, in the first 5 or so albums I would suggest to maybe pick up by Terry, but it is a good example of what he has in more current years been doing. There's a lot of overdubbed voice on here. There are some lyrics, and I don't know if it was this particular album or another one where he sings lyrics, but I was listening to these recently, and it struck me that his voice sounds a lot. When he sings lyrics, I prefer when he does chanting, like you hear him doing in the background now, or wordless vocals, as he does a tiny bit, but extremely well and absolutely perfect in the Lifespan movie soundtrack. There's some wordless vocals in there which are just absolutely beautiful and fantastic. I wouldn't call them chanting, but they're really effective. I like the chanting's not bad either. When he starts doing the singing lyrics, which he does on several of these albums, even a couple of them that I've already showed, that's where it gets a little weak for me. And and I remember listening to these to prepare doing the video, and it struck me that his voice sounds a lot like, who does it remind me of? It reminds me of Robert Wyatt. Probably 90% Robert Wyatt and 10% David Allen from Gone. And I thought, gee, maybe, I don't think that's just me. And I happened to go online on Amazon, and I was reading somebody's review of the particular album that I was listening to that has vocals on it. And I'll be damned if the guy didn't say the exact same thing that I was just thinking from a review that had been written years before, saying his singing voice sounds like a cross between Robert Wyatt and David Allen. And I thought, wow, that's really, I must be right then, because exactly what I thought. So this is a nice, I would say, if you're somebody that's kind of following Terry Riley and what he's been up to and the different areas that he's worked in. This is probably, now I don't have everything Terry did, but this Atlantis Nath is probably one of the ones you would have to pick up. It's not as accessible as some of his works. It is a lot more accessible than some of his other things, though. And it's got a combination of instruments in here. You know, with Terry doing piano and some MIDI electronic stuff. He does quite a bit of voice in here, regular piano. There's also a string quartet that plays along with him, along with synthesizer. There's a guy who plays a fretless acoustic guitar on one track. And as I mentioned, a guy that does spoken text on the last track. So there's a bit of variety. I kid you not, it's certainly an odd album. And I would definitely call it avant-garde and experimental, but it's not as difficult as a lot of the things that he's done. And, it's one of those things you got to be in the mood for it, though. Moving on, I have to change the music now, so I got to go back a couple screens here. Okay. Now you hear guitar. You should hear guitar a little bit. Here's another, the Book of Abi Wazud, which is something that Terry made up. Another, I guess, concept album of pieces of his. This one is where we're getting toward Terry's albums now done as a composer, where he doesn't necessarily play on them. Perhaps a little bit, and in a lot of cases, not at all. And I don't think he plays on this album at all. He's listed only as being the composer. There's a percussionist who plays marimba and hand drums on a couple tracks, and Tracy Silverman is the violinist. He was in one of the that Windham Hill String Quartet thing. He was an original member of. I can't remember the name. Turtle Island String Quartet, I think. Most of the music is geared toward nylon string guitars, actually played by a guy, David Tannenbaum, and also by Terry's son, Guyan Riley, who's a pretty damn good guitarist, but he went to university and actually studied music. So, and he's, for a guy born in 1977 too, he's a young guy in my mind, and hell of a guitarist. The music is not what you'd expect. Most of the music is the nylon string guitar, often in duos. So it's essentially like a live recording of the various pieces have different combinations. There is, I think, one piece that's for 3 guitars together. There's another piece, I think, for 2 guitars. And I believe all these things were recorded essentially live in the studio. There's a piece that I think is the guitar and percussion is on, all different kind of percussion instruments. Not heavy in the drum world so much, lighter percussion than that, and marimba. The big part of the album is guitar, the classical guitar, in duet with violin, and it's kind of odd. This is not one of those that I would go and necessarily recommend. There's Terry, and that's not his son with him on the back cover, even though his son is quite prominent on the album. It's actually guitarist David Tannenbaum. And most of the music is essentially the pieces range. A lot of guitar and violin pieces. And it's not kind of what I expected when I saw guitar and violin. I figured the guitar would be playing chords and the violin would be playing these kind of semi-pretty melodies over it. It's more frantic than that. And it's oddly, the guitar is playing in a kind of similar to the violin in a way. It's playing a lot of very fast single note runs, or runs that, there's a whole bunch of very fast runs on the guitar, single note runs, and it may end in a broken chord, like 2 or 3 notes or something like that, but it fades away really quickly. And the violin is also playing a little bit frantically over that. And it's not very full sounding because the guitar is not playing chords supporting the violin. It's almost as if 2 violins were playing or something like that. So it has a kind of odd flavor to a lot of those pieces that have the guitar and the violin in them. There are sections where the guitar plays some chords, so you've got a fuller, more kind of traditional sounding thing. But it's an odd composition. The larger composition is a piece called Cantos Desertos, I guess is how it's pronounced. And that's a 5-part composition that has the guitars and the guitar and percussion and the guitar and violin, and it's a little bit on the weird side. You know, it's over my head a little bit. There's a couple more pieces that, because they have more than one guitar in them, are a little fuller sounding, maybe more what you would expect. But it's a little bit of an odd album and a little bit of a hard sell for me. You know, it's odd. You know, and this is from what year? 1999. This came out, and the pieces were all written around that time. You know, in the late 90s. So it's, you know, again, this is something that is of more recent vintage. But, you know, I have to be honest, it's, I've been listening to this, well, back when I started my series, I was really heavily listening to a lot of Terry Riley in order to prepare for this. It's an odd one. Not easy to get into. Like I said, I think it's just over my head. It might be one that, you know, in 20 years, if I'm still around, I might go, oh, I get it now. So we're kind of in the world of Terry Riley, composer now and not performer. And here's a really interesting one, which I have to switch the music again because I want to be proper about this. But first I have to find it. Here we go. Here's one of the, I'd spoken on a previous part about one of his albums I have that has a particularly poor version of In C, kind of like In C for a rock band in the early 70s, which is, as I mentioned, probably the worst version of In C you'd ever want to hear. I have another version of In C, which is one that, if you're interested in C, beyond the original late 1960s version of it, which really is the version you should hear first and you should get. But after that, because of the concept of the piece in C, and every performance of it will be different, you could, you know, basically spend a day listening to all the different versions of In C and potentially not get tired of it because every performance is different because of the it leaves a lot up to the size of the group, which can vary, and what the individual instrumentalists in that group choose to play in terms of they have specific parts to play, but how frequently they repeat the phrases, or where and when they choose to repeat the phrases that they're given for their instrument are entirely up to them, meaning every performance would be different. Plus the instrumentation can be different. So it's not necessarily even set on a specific set of instruments like in a classical orchestra. So, when did they record this? January of 1989, a Chinese orchestra decides to record a version of In C. The Shanghai Film Orchestra. And does a version. It's about 28.5 minutes. There are other compositions on here that are not by Terry Riley, which are worthwhile listening to, but you know, I don't want to get into that because then then the video will go on to be about 24 hours long. But there is a version, 28 and a half minutes of in C, done by a rather large Chinese orchestra, and so they have different instrumentation than what you would hear from an American orchestra, or in fact, a lot of permeations in America of the various musicians that have performed in C, because whether they choose purely orchestral instruments or maybe more American modern instruments, there's a similarity there in the various American versions, whereas in the Chinese versions, you've got all these unique, interesting ethnic instruments playing in C, and it really works well. It was recorded, and what label is this on? This is I think this is pretty regularly, easily available. This is on Celestial Harmonies. You know what I'm wondering? I think they're still around. I think Celestial Harmonies is still around. I hope they are. A really good label. And I just don't recall having seen anything very recent from them, unfortunately. But this was, I think this is still available. Highly recommended after you hear the original in C. Recorded January 1989. It was mixed in March of 1989. And here's the interesting thing, but it's not explained anywhere in the liner notes. It was recorded in China naturally, but the tapes were brought back to California where they were mixed by Terry Riley, trumpeter John Hassell, who doesn't play on it, and Brian Eno. And there's no explanation as to why these two folks were involved in the mixing at all. I can see Terry Riley being involved in the mixing of it. I don't know why Brian Eno and John Hassell were involved in the mixing, which is something I had completely forgot about until I pulled this out to listen to again. Very interesting, and an interesting piece. Okay, now I have to find. I think this is what I'm looking. Yes, this is what I'm looking for. Okay. One of my favorite Terry Riley albums, which is a Terry Riley composer album that Terry does not play on, because it works really well, is this one. This is on New Albion Records by the Rova, R-O-V-A, Saxophone Quartet. Chanting the Light of Foresight. And what year is this from? I want to say the late 90s. 1994. So, it's definitely modern times. The funny thing is, I'm not necessarily in love with saxophone quartets. So the reason that I like this so much is not because I'm in love with saxophone quartets, but rather it works really well. It just works well. Terry wrote these pieces, I believe, specifically for Rova Saxophone Quartet, and it's pretty deep, it's pretty intense, and one thing that I had assumed, and listening closely to it, this comes up time and time again. It seems that when Terry Riley writes for small ensembles, here you have Rova Saxophone Quartet. I always assumed that the pieces were written strictly for a quartet setting, and I'm fairly sure there are pieces on here that may be just for quartet. But I also am hearing in one of the large-scale pieces, there's like a 17-minute piece on here. I'm hearing an awful lot of sounds for a saxophone quartet, and then it dawned on me is maybe Terry's not necessarily writing just for a live quartet setting, but he's writing for the band, meaning I believe there's overdubs in here. So there may be 8 parts. There's a longer piece on here that I said, look, that is about 17 minutes. And it sounds like there's way more than 4 saxophones going on. It almost sounds like a mini, if you weren't really focused in on the sound, it almost sounds like a mini classical orchestra. So I don't necessarily think when Terry writes for these ensembles that he's strictly writing for them in a live context. Because the big piece on here, the 17-minute piece, there's an awful lot of colors in there, and there's an awful lot of stuff going on that doesn't sound to me to be so much studio manipulation, to make the sound bigger, but rather I think there's overdubbing going on, which is interesting. So it may be Terry writing for the musicians and not just the live ensemble. If you really like saxophones and you like saxophone quartets, you would love this, but I think this is one of his very successful, in terms of, musically, you could really sit down and get into it, albums, where that Terry doesn't do any performing on, but he does, compose all the music for the ensemble. So, Chanting the Light of Foresight from Rova Saxophone Quartet. This is already running a lot longer than I hoped it would. And I ain't done. I am showing everything I have by Terry, though, so there won't be a sequel to this until I pick up another batch of Terry's things, which would be some time. So, one of the best known, probably the most well-known group of musicians that Terry Riley wrote pieces for that he didn't necessarily perform with is the Kronos Quartet, which is a string quartet. I don't know. The first album he wrote fully, the entire album for the group, came out in 1985, called Cadenza on the Night Plane. And I think it was a pretty big deal album because I remember hearing a lot about it. And I don't know if it was, like nominated for Grammys or anything like that in the classical world. My guess is it probably was. And for years I thought I had the album, but I don't. I was getting it confused. I don't actually have Cadenza on the Night Plane, which, like I said, came out in, I switched windows now, so I lost the dates of everything. Came out in 84. But in 1989, he wrote, again for the Kronos Quartet, which is a string quartet, a 2-record set called Salome Dances for Peace? Yes, Salome Dances for Peace. This is the old fat, remember when the 2 CD sets used to come in these real fat boy boxes? Well, that's what this is. So 5 years after his first full album written for the Kronos Quartet, Terry went back in and dove in and did it more, writing almost 2 hours, 1 hour and 58 minutes worth of music for the Kronos String Quartet. Looking at it, when I looked up the data for this, I was a little surprised that, at least in America, this particular album came out on my 30th birthday in 1989, in late October. It actually came out on my 30th birthday. Now, 1989 was before the internet and everything, so you tended not to find out about albums very quickly until you went out to the store, which is why, back then, I went to the record stores quite a lot. I don't think a month would pass by that I didn't go to a record store, because you never knew what was going to come out in any given week. Except for, if you were heavily into like the biggest rock bands that were around, if Led Zeppelin or the Rolling Stones or something like that were coming out with a new album, you might hear about that in advance. But there was no internet to find out about this stuff. TV wasn't going to talk about it. But this was apparently a big album that came out, and I remember walking into the store. I actually have the receipt here in the box, early in February. So just a couple months after the album was actually released, and it was probably just getting to the stores, because you have to realize, even though this was a big deal and a big classical album at the time, the only records that most record stores would make sure that they had on release day were the popular stuff, the rock stuff, the pop stuff. They were less concerned with making sure they got a classical record in the week that it was released, even one that could be potentially a hit in the classical world. But this was a big deal. This Fat Boy, this two-disc set. Now, for me personally, I am not a fan of string quartets, and in fact, the only full albums of string quartet music I have are the ones that Terry Riley wrote. And I remember, I think I may have not even been aware that this album was out, but in the classical section, I believe it was on display as a new release in the long, if you remember the CD long boxes, the cardboard boxes they used to have. And in each section of this particular store that I would shop at, they had, the new releases in the rock section and the new releases in the jazz section. And I believe the reason I found out about this was because it was prominently displayed in the new releases of the classical section. And I saw it was string quartet. I am just not a fan of string quartets. The music is too samey sounding for me. I have string quartet pieces on various classical albums. Where you've got a classical album by a specific composer, but he wrote, and he happened to write a piece for string quartet, but he also wrote pieces for piano and pieces for orchestra, or just general compilation classical albums, different pieces by different artists. I do have string quartets on there, but I didn't have any just full albums that were just string quartets. But being such a hardcore fan already in 1989 of Terry Riley, I decided, well, I'm gonna bite the bullet. I'm gonna shell out the $23 and for almost 2 hours worth of string quartet music. And it wasn't the easiest thing to get into, but it's not terribly avant-garde. But like I mentioned in the previous album, now listening back to this, because it was a few years, it's been a few years since I listened to this, and then I pulled this out and started listening again to all of my, day and night actually, for several weeks. I had my Terry Riley stuff in rotation, and that was probably also one of the things that kind of helped me get into the classical thing that I've been in now, especially that the warm weather came. But this even predated that, because the weather was still a bit on the cool side when I started listening to this stuff. And by the time I was kind of done playing it on a daily basis, the weather was warm, and all of a sudden I found myself in the classical mode that I spoke about in my other videos that are previous videos. So yes, string quartet's a hard sell for me, and almost 2 hours of string quartet is a hard sell, but it's Terry Riley. Now the thing listening to this again that I noticed that I hadn't noticed before, like I mentioned on the Rova saxophone quartet, listening closely to that, I believe that there's pieces with overdubbing on there. Now there's a lot of pieces on here that are evidently, obviously, strictly for the live string quartet. However, I believe it's the first piece on here, which is a bit of a larger scale piece. I'm hearing an awful lot for string quartet. And it's only upon listening to this, I think there's at least 2 parts for every player in here. In other words, it sounds like they recorded a string quartet and they recorded another string quartet over it, which is making me think that when Terry Riley writes for these groups, he does write some material for the live group as it exists with its number of players, however many there are, but he also writes for what the band is capable of doing in the studio, not necessarily live. In other words, there's more than 4 parts going on here, I'm sure, especially in the first piece, which is 11 minutes long, so it's one of the longer scale pieces. I hear an awful lot going on, In fact, it sounds like the whole string section of an orchestra at times, which is an interesting way of doing it. And also, it does help the depth of the piece a little bit, and also it prevents every piece from having the over the course of 2 hours of having a samey sound. But still, even with the overdubs, which makes a nice, it gives a lot more depth to the pieces that apparently there's some overdubbing on than just the standard string quartet. But it still is 2 hours of string quartet music, or essentially for those 4 instruments. And I know in recent years there has been, I believe, a 4th album in the series that Terry, I thought I saw it listed somewhere, that Terry wrote again for the Kronos Quartet in recent years. I do have the 3rd one, which comes after this, from 1989. Another album, the 3rd full album, called Requiem for Adam, which is the 3rd in the series of albums that Terry wrote for the Kronos Quartet. And I'm trying to find out what year it was from. 20-something. But I'm not seeing it here. Well, I'm going to say 2000. Damn it. I looked all these up, but the list of his works is so long, I can't find it now. It's a None Such album. Damn it. Yeah, I want to say about 2001, but for some reason it's not listed in this one. Let me look. I have 2 discographies listed here. Yes, 2001. That was right. Requiem for Adam is the 3rd album written by Terry Riley for the Kronos Quartet. This one is quite a bit different from the others, and unless you're a hardcore fan and you really want to hear a full album of just string quartet music, this is the one that I would recommend to folks. Now, I only have 2 out of the 4. But I know, for instance, Cadenza on the Night Plane, the 1st album that he recorded for Kronos Quartet, is strictly the Kronos Quartet playing. On this one, there's a 3-piece composition which runs under 42 minutes. This is a very short album. This is about 47 minutes, this album. So it's much shorter than even the 2 individual albums in the previous Kronos Quartet album. So there's a 42-minute piece is called Requiem for Adam, which was a piece that was written in memoriam of one of the Kronos Quartet players, one of the founding members. His son passed away as a teenager. And Terry basically wrote this piece for them, for the Kronos Quartet, in remembrance of Adam, who was the son of, I want to say it's David Harrington, the violin player. I'm pretty sure, yeah, of the Kronos Quartet. And it's a 42-minute piece. It's in 3 parts. And parts 1 and 2 are for the quartet. Now, again, I haven't listened to this in a couple weeks, but I think they're I'm not sure on either the 1st or 2nd part. There may be overdubbing because there seems to be quite a bit of depth to the recording, and sometimes it's hard to tell. Is it just the way that the recording studio is used, or are there more than one part? In other words, it's not just a quartet playing. That I'm not sure of. The difference in this one, though, is there's a 2nd part that's the shortest part. It runs about 7 minutes. It actually has Terry Riley playing synthesizers on it, or MIDI stuff. And so you have this first part that starts with the strings, and then all of a sudden there's goes into the 2nd part where there's this big percussion crash, which is Terry playing basically sampled percussion on a keyboard. And then he kind of settles down a little bit, but it's very jarring because you're listening to what you think is a string quartet album. The 2nd part suddenly starts with this bang and crash of sampled percussion that's actually played by Terry, and then it goes into well, I'm gonna play it. There we go. There it is, and I hope it's not too loud. It's quite jarring after you hear this very long 13.5-minute section devoted to strictly strings. All of a sudden have this like rat-a-tat percussion and explosive percussion going on, but it's does settle down into basically almost like I say like a synthesizer orchestra, where Terry's using a lot of the sounds of horns, sampled horns, played on a keyboard, and the Kronos Quartet is playing along with Terry's parts, and Terry's parts are overdubbed, so there's a few things going on. But oddly enough, the string quartet is actually more in the background, so it kind of sounds like an orchestral backing that's just supporting what Terry's playing on the keyboard, and most of the keyboard is kind of aping other orchestral instruments that aren't like string instruments. So there's horns and percussion sounds. It's really interesting, but it only goes on for 7 minutes before it goes into the third part, which is 21 minutes long, which is strictly, again, the Kronos Quartet, string quartet. But after hearing that second part, that's that 7-minute part, where Terry's doing his weird things on the synthesizer, with the orchestra supporting him, I wish that Terry would do a full album like that. This would be really interesting. Like I said, this whole piece is only 42 minutes long, but I think it really encapsulates Terry's writing for the Kronos Quartet in a nice way. Take away the 7 minutes of the second part, which is mostly Terry on synthesizers, and you only actually have about 35 minutes of the Kronos Quartet by themselves, strictly as a string group. I won't say live because I think there's some overdubbing going on there, but this whole album has maybe about 35 minutes of the actual just Kronos Quartet playing by themselves. So it's not a whole lot of string quartet music. And the album ends, maybe because it's so short or for whatever reason, they included a just under 6-minute solo piano piece that Terry Riley was working on in the studio at the same time that that either he was writing the piece for the Kronos Quartet or the recording of the piece for the Kronos Quartet was going on. I'm not sure. But Terry was also working on other music outside of for the Kronos Quartet project. And maybe because the album is so short or whatever, they also included this 6-minute piano piece, solo piano, by Terry, which ends the album. And it's not really supposedly connected to this Requiem for Adam, but I have to say that, man, it makes the album flow really nicely, because you have the first piece by the Kronos Quartet, and you have the strings going on, that weird second piece where all of a sudden Terry's on synthesizers and he's banging on, sampled percussion, and all this wild stuff is going on. And then another 21.5 minutes, all of a sudden the Kronos Quartet comes back on the string quartet, and then that piece ends, and then you go down to this solo piano piece for about 6 minutes. And it's almost like he could have intended it to be the last section of the Requiem for Adam instead of a completely separate piece that it is, really unconnected to the Requiem. It just makes the album flow nice, has a nice ending to it. As a result, a bit more colors on it than the other albums where he wrote music for the Kronos Quartet because of his involvement on keyboards. And so this is one that is definitely in my to get list. And really, if you're following Terry Riley, at all, you probably do have to pick up something that he did for the Kronos Quartet, simply because he's been involved with them now since 1984 or so. And his records, you know, the pieces that he writes for them are a big deal. There's a lot of them now. And it's apparently still an ongoing thing, because there has been in more recent years another album that of pieces he wrote for them, which I have to check out. I don't know what that consists of. So this went on a lot longer than I wanted it to, but that is everything. And I was actually going to jump back and talk a little bit more about the Lifespan soundtracks and things like that, but you know, it's already, you know, you'll have to go back and watch what I said, I guess, in the earlier pieces that I did for Terry, because this is getting quite long. So that's everything. Part 4, the final chapter. There won't be a sequel unless or until I get at least another 4 or 5 Terry Riley albums, which will probably be sometime, but not in the very near future. And that's it. I hope maybe anybody that's interested in Terry, maybe this helped as a kind of buyer's guide a little bit. I only have an overview of his works. So I couldn't even pick. If I had everything, I could pick out albums that you should get maybe versus albums that should be ignored. But I just showed everything I had, you know, good, bad, or indifferent or whatever. So I just want to reiterate, though, that even for those albums I'm not crazy about, in a lot of cases I think it's just beyond my comprehension. And like I said, and I bring it up again because it's a very important point. Remember, this is Terry Riley's world. We're just living in it. So I didn't want you to forget that. I'll be back with my regular tomfoolery now that I've finally gotten to the final chapter of Terry Riley. Okay, guys. Hope everything's going groovy out there for you all. It's evening once again here in the garage, and I'll be back. I'll be back sooner than you want me to be back. I guarantee you that. Okay? I'll see you soon.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.